Hello, I'm Bill Hopkins, President of the Cross Timbers Chapter. Today, we are pleased to present Chuck Stanley, who's going to talk about the role of fire and control burning. First, Cindy Crump will introduce Chuck.
So just a little bit about Chuck. He's a native Texan. He's a graduate of Texas Tech University in 1992 with a BS in rangeland management from Tech. And he got his MS degree in 1997 from Tech also, studying effects of prescribed fire on mesquite. And after that, he managed a 3,000-acre ranch for a couple of years. And in 1999, he joined the Natural Resource Conservation Service. He was a rangeland management specialist in Oklahoma. And in 2005, he joined the Central National Technology Support Center in Fort Worth. You might have to explain that one a little bit, Chuck, because I'm not too familiar with that one. And he's been on the board of directors for the Texas section of the Society for Range Management from 2015 to 2017. And he's currently on the board for the Great Plains Fire Science Program, the Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils, and sometimes serves as an air resource advisor for the United States Fire Science on wildland fires. He lives with Catherine Stanley. She is one of our chapter members, and she is an agricultural engineer for the NRCS at the Texas State Office. Well, if you haven't guessed by now, Chuck is going to be talking to us tonight about fire and prescribed burning. And the title of his program is A Look at Fire, Another Native of North America. And Chuck, welcome to the meeting tonight. And we're so excited to have you here. And
like Cindy had mentioned, I've been involved with fire mainly when I was at Texas Tech. Dr. Henry Wright, who was my major professor there, and one of the pioneers of prescribed burning, got me interested in fire and prescribed burning. Kind of an interesting way when I walked in to his office on my first day, and we're talking, wanted to know what I wanted to do and all that. And then he asked if I'd ever burned anything. And I just had a look of surprise, of course. And my first answer was on purpose. And he said, well, yeah, on purpose. And I thought, oh my gosh, how far back does this permanent record go? And how did he get it? But anyway, I've been burning, involved with prescribed fire since 1987. And it doesn't seem like that long until I think back and been doing this for over 30 years. Like Cindy said, I'm a rangeland specialist. I'm now at the Central National Technology Support Center, which is a branch of the national office for the NRCS, if you will. And we do a lot of technology support for the states around the country. And one of mine, of course, is prescribed burn training. So I bet I could talk a little bit more about my interest in prescribed fire, but it goes further back than Texas Tech. And I didn't know it at the time until I started doing presentations that I'd actually been involved longer. So let's move on. So I was going to do a little bit of talking today on the history of fire in itself, and then prescribed fire as it goes along. First, I want to clarify some of the definitions that get thrown around in amongst themselves, and I want it to be clear what we're talking about. First off, wildfire. Wildfire is what you see on the media most all the time, right? And wildfire is one that is unplanned, it is uncontrolled, whether it is either ignited by lightning or humans. The next one is controlled fire. So controlled fire is one that is intentionally lit by a human with the intent to control it, but it's most likely didn't involve any planning or very much planning for that matter. And it's usually the one referenced by the media most oftenly when they talk about a controlled burn that escaped. Prescribed fire is completely different from either of those. It is one that is thoughtfully planned out, has a written plan and prescription along with those objectives for the burn. It is going to include fire breaks, weather parameters, the labor that it takes to conduct this fire safely, and other things like that. Did that change right? I hope. So,
I believe so.
historical accounts of early explorers that are noted many times in their journals about the prairies burning. A lot of times they would note that the fire could be seen on the horizon for miles and miles. At nighttime, they would talk about there being a glow on the horizon that they could see as far as they could see. Many times they talked about the next day or a couple of days when they finally got to it of the blackened earth where the fires had passed the day or so before. And of course, they always talked about the buffalo or bison by the thousands that roam these areas, not necessarily in the black, but a lot of times when the travelers were coming back through the area that burned, a lot of times they would see the bison in those burned areas that had already started greening back up. So it's very important to recognize that grazing, fire, and drought are the three most important ecological considerations of native and natural grasslands. So let's talk about that a little bit. And we said that at the beginning that fire was most likely ignited by humans or lightning. So, in the anthropological use of fire by the indigenous peoples was a big factor in that. Fire has been a part of the natural ecosystem since the origin of climate on Earth. Comrick noted that man has probably used and kept fire for more than 500,000 years, but has only really learned to use it during the last 20,000 years or so. That becomes pretty important. Lightning fires. Comrick also noted that on the average, there's over 100 strikes per second and greater than 3 billion strikes per year. But out of that, there's only 2,000 to maybe 75,000 fires from those lightning strikes that occur in the US. And the reason there's not more fires is probably because, or that lightning fires don't burn large areas, is that the main reason will be that the moisture in the form of precipitation or higher humidity accompanies these thunderstorms. Pine in 1982 discussed that it's the effect of lightning fires may be small when you look at it over the entire continent, but at the local level, it may be really significant. As in the previous slide there, the Native Americans certainly set fires and used it. To a lesser extent, when the colonists came across and the settlers, they set fires, maybe not necessarily on purpose. But the main point here is that fire has always been a component in the ecological development of the vegetation. So the causes of US wildfires. This is from the National Interagency Fire Center. And it shows here what basically boils down to two ignition sources, being humans and lightning. And over the past few decades, this shows here from the previous decade, wildfires have been mostly caused by people. But if you look at the acreages burned, humans usually are only responsible for less than, whoops, I'm sorry. Apparently that's on a timer that I didn't know. So why is the difference? Lightning spark fires in remote parts of the West, Alaska, consume large acreages before they are contained. And in a lot of cases, these blazes are allowed to burn to reduce fuels. A lot of the human-caused fires in populated areas are more quickly controlled. Here we can see the regional breakdown of those fires. In the East, California and southeastern US, the humans are mostly responsible for starting the majority of the fires. Whereas in the Great Basin, it's 40% or fewer. So let's talk a little bit about the Native Americans and what their influence was on the native prairies, and as far as that goes, across the entire North American continent. Omar Stewart wrote a book, but he never got it published, called Forgotten Fires. He wrote this book back in the 50s, but he was one of those anthropologists that his peers and cohorts didn't accept the fact that the Native Americans had a lot of influence on the landscape in North America. Cat Anderson and Henry Lewis got this book and actually had it published back in 2002. It's a really good book if you have a chance to read it, and it really breaks down the impact that the Native Americans had on the landscape across the continent. Previous ecologists and land managers basically didn't want to accept it and said the Indians used fire, but really didn't have an effect on successional phases to the so-called climax plant communities. And they believed that the hunter-gatherers were environmentally benign and incapable of influencing the productivity and the availability of their natural resources. In fact, the Native Americans possessed the tools and more likely the will to use it. And it shows too. Some of the other slides that I'll be showing you here, the anthropogenic fire that has gone on for years. As stated by Martinez in '98, there was no pristine wilderness here. The prairie and forest were to a large extent the creation of indigenous peoples. And much of what is designated as wilderness today was exploited and manipulated by fire from the Native Americans. Pine stated, though, that much of this burning resulted from malice, play, war, accidental escapes, and sheer fire littering. I don't think that was necessarily true. I think they had a use for fire and they used it well. Moving on, Anderson noted that contemporary Indians often use the word wilderness as a negative label for land that was not taken care of by humans for a long time. And James Rust, a Southern Sierra Miwok elder, noted that the white man sure ruined this country. It's turned it back to wilderness. And the same elder, I guess, but all the burning was limited to the Indians or Native Americans who were looked up to as leaders, understood fire and how it should be handled. So there's other accounts of various tribes using fire and how they had to use it. And one of the Pomo tribes fitted tail feathers of herons with long wooden handles to create fire fans to augment the blaze. So that's interesting. And Lewis in 1973 concluded that the Native Americans probably burned the landscape for at least 70 different reasons. Now, I'm not going to go through 70 different reasons with you here, but a lot of it makes sense. It makes it easier to plant. It drove the animals where they wanted them to hunt them. Probably heard a lot of this. And there's 70 reasons we could go on for a while. So let's jump ahead a little bit. And I'm kind of like that. I go back and forth to different areas, and that's just kind of the way my brain works. So that's kind of how my presentations end up too. But in the end, I hope it all makes sense. So before the Civil War, over 75% of the population of the South was made up of pastoral herders from the Celtic origin, from England, France, and Spain, where they used fire, and it was an important part of their culture. The Europeans used fire for a long time, and the king finally made it to where fire was basically illegal, and it didn't matter how the fire started, you were going to be liable for it. And the only people that actually used fire were basically the outlaws. So we started settling the area, and the fires they began to get stopped. Why? You know, fear. We grew up fearing fire, congestion, ownership boundaries and fencing, reduction of fuel loads, harvesting, or the cropping and harvesting methods were used. Overgrazing, interesting, fencing, ownership boundaries, and overgrazing are boundaries that are set up for fire. And quite frankly, that's not how fire moved across the landscape, but that's another reason for stopping it. The lack of understanding what fire played on the landscape and the ecology of the plants that were here is another reason that it was stopped. And proven technology of how to carry out a fire. Excuse me. And the traditions and habits that come along with different generations. For a long period of time, fire was bad because it killed the trees, and that was something they needed to harvest. And you hear it a lot today. Why would I want to burn that if I can graze it? And I'll get into that a little bit more coming up. Another thing that happened, now you're going to see me bounce around a little bit, but Smoky Bear syndrome came across. Only you can prevent forest fires. And another less notable, but it really struck with the younger kids, was Bambi. And I know everybody should have seen Bambi. And there was a lot of things that made fire in the forest and the grasslands seem bad. In earnest, during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency is when fire suppression really started. And man themselves have a natural tendency to fear the fire because it is difficult to control. So a lot of ad campaigns came out across the country during this time. Fire's the destroyer, keep him out of the forest, keep him out of the California woods. Death rides the forest when man is careless. These are a lot of ad campaigns. Prevent fire, save the game and fish, the grass and the soil. That came out of Oklahoma. Here's another. Stopping the fire demon claims millions of acres every year. This is God's country. I kind of like this ad out of Oregon State. This is God's country. Don't set it on fire and make it look like hell. I'm not sure how they knew what hell looked like, but you know, it was a good ad campaign, right? So we have feared fire from when we were a child. and it comes from many different sources, the ag campaigns and everything. But basically, parents, grandparents, don't play with fire. You're going to get burned. Don't play with matches. If you play with fire, you're going to wet the bed. By the way, I finally got over that quite a few years ago, even though I still play with fire. But I tell you one thing, sometimes you need to get burned to understand how it works, and not to play with fire. And I've had fires that have escaped. We had a big one escape when I was at Texas Tech. And we even made the news and made national news. And of course, the media said it was controlled burn that got away. And it was something that was just a fluke accident, but we ended up burning about 30,000 bonus acres, if you will. And the interesting thing, the news and the media were going on that it was over 100,000 acres. And it wasn't. But the one of the things about it was we were burning on this landowner. It started out we burned 2,500 acres, and the winds did get up, and firebrand jumped a 300-foot black line. And the winds picked up, and it burned this 30,000 acres over the next few days. But no structures, animals, or anything was lost other than some fences. But the landowner that it burned on, for the most part, was wanting to hire us at Tech to burn his property as soon as we could. and we did. It just didn't turn out to be a prescribed fire like we had intended. So let's go back to Bambi. I'm going to get into this. Bambi was introduced in 1943. And if you look at the video, maybe some of you will go back and watch it again, but it really had a pro-fire ecology message. But I don't think anybody got it, because what they saw, I'm going to see if my pointer works. What they saw were the animals running from the fire, and the forest being burned up afterwards. But really what the ecological message was that after the fire, the animals there still lived, and the plants and everything came back. But that wasn't necessarily taken. So Smokey the Bear, let's talk about him a little bit. That campaign began in 1944 from an ad agency in Los Angeles. This was one of the biggest campaigns that ever came across that had a negative effect on fire itself. The first slogan, "Care will prevent 9 out of 10 forest fires." And then the famous message appeared in 1947 that only you can prevent forest fires. In 1950, the cub was found in the Lincoln National Forest after a wildfire went through, and got the name Smokey. Smokey was then sent to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and died there in 1976. So popular was Smokey the Bear that he had his own zip code. In 1952, Smokey Bear Act became law that you couldn't use that image for anything other than what fire prevention was meant to. I don't know for sure, but at one time I saw an image of Smokey Bear with a drip torch in his hand, and I don't know if that was before the law or if it was after it. And it may not have ever been shown to anybody else. I don't know. But now even Smokey's changed his tune to a certain extent that only you can prevent wildfires. And there's a lot of that, a lot of truth to that. But how do you combat this anti-fire icon? It's difficult. So In other parts of the US, fire is still going to be condemned, even though the research that has been done has shown that it was a part of the ecology. It wasn't until the 1960 that fire was accepted in California and other Western states. And in fact, Leopold Report in 1963 stated that protecting all communities from fire could be bad. And the exclusion of fire in grassland and forest has no place on the North American continent. And as seen from the 1988 Yellowstone fires, prescribed fire was still not widely accepted in many places. There's 650 million acres of federal land. That's 30% of the US. And in 2016, the agencies only burned 1.8 million acres with prescribed fire. That is not enough prescribed fire to protect a lot of anything. So, like I said, I jump around a little bit. Now I want to talk a little bit about the animals. And this goes back to Bambi a little bit. But in general, I think most animals are really smart. They are accustomed to fires and wildfires. They have been. It's ingrained in them. They don't necessarily get scared and run. And everybody, I think a lot of people have seen this photo of the elk in the river and the wildfire burning behind them. Do they look scared? Are they running away? Yeah, they just meandering down the river. They're in a safe place, and apparently the photographer was too. So you got to take it into context. These animals, they know what to do during a wildfire. I read a article on the plane going to North Dakota to do prescribed fire training last month, and it was in the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation magazine. The researchers is either Colorado or Montana had a herd of elk that they had GPS collars on them, and a wildfire had gone through there, and they were really worried about their elk and what happened to them. And what they found out and were astonished by, that the largest portion of the herd actually sheltered in place throughout the wildfire. I was up in Oregon on a wildfire, and we do the town hall meetings, and it always comes up that the animals are not surviving this, and in general the animals are very good. The slower animals that can't get out of the way generally are the only ones impacted. Some reptiles, porcupines. In prescribed fires, we can control the fire to give them escape routes before the fire is closed off. But anyway, it was entertaining in Oregon. The fire behavior analyst went up in a helicopter the day after the town hall, and we're flying over the blackened areas, and the elk and deer were numerous, but they were all in the black. Number one, the black is a safe place to be, but number two, the forages start growing back almost immediately after the fire passes. Another thing, that animals, they're opportunists, go into these fires afterwards, and there's a lot of things. If the snakes, salamanders, things like that don't necessarily make it out, the Swanson hawk is taking advantage of that. Smoked crickets, grasshoppers, salamanders, pretty good eating. So it's not always all bad that the fire goes through. I just wanted to show this real quick and not talk about it a whole lot, but here's a generalized successional pattern following a fire in a forest type. And a wildfire that gets up into the crowns is certainly going to take care of that and burn those crowns off. But afterwards, you get these annual forbs and grasses that come in, and the animals, there's a lot of forage for them. And then The next year or so, the grass form and woody seedlings start to sprout, and then it starts moving back towards the climax. So here in Texas, this multi-stem climax community, you see that quite readily on places that have either burned or been treated on mesquite, where once was a nice big mesquite tree, perhaps. Now it's hundreds of multi-stem mesquite trees that are really a pain, and it takes more effort to control those. So the wildfires we see on TV, you see this a lot. Billions and billions of dollars get spent every year trying to control these and contain them. And they do go up. And there's a lot of different reasons of how they start and that sort of thing, just to throw a little fun in it. And there's a lot of truth to this too, but if those old boys would graze their place like us, they wouldn't be fighting grass fires all the time. There's a lot of truth to that. And if you're doing prescribed burning, somebody that has overgrazed makes a great fire break for controlling those burns. But as Cindy had mentioned, I've got to go on quite a few wildfires. I haven't been in the last couple of years just due to workload that I have. But I was a air resource advisor, which basically is going out to the wildfires and monitoring the smoke that is there and being able to give reports and predictions on what that smoke's going to do and the health impacts that come along with that during those wildfire instances. And they do get great, and you can see it on the satellite images that they have. There's some different websites that Worldview is one of them. You can actually watch the smoke, and it impacts a lot larger area than just those where that wildfire happens to be burning. But that is one of the main things that people have problems with now, and enough smoke in the air and people with health problems, this does become a real concern. This just showing a little bit of what we did on the wildfires, set up the monitors in different parts of the country, go to the town halls and talk to them, tell them about the air quality that's going to be happening for the next day or so, and some of the mitigation things that they can take into account during those. That particular place was at the Grand Tetons, where I was at, which is another thing, one thing good, I guess, about getting to go on those wildfires. I get to see places that I may not have seen as soon. Catherine, my wife, was wanting to go to Yellowstone. And I said, oh, I don't have time to go there. And the next week I got called on a wildfire to Yellowstone. So I got to go there. But like I said before on the animals, they're not really that afraid of it. This young moose, you can see how hazy and smoky it is. They wasn't too worried about anything, probably more worried about us, but they wasn't too excited. Elk, there's a fire going around this area. This is in Yellowstone. They just happy grazing along like they normally do. Wasn't too worried about anything. This is also in Yellowstone, and this happened to be where the fires went through in 1988, and it hadn't burned since then. If you notice this helicopter here, we were standing on the river. West Yellowstone is back down here, and we were watching the helicopter go, and there were some tourists from Germany, and they said, well, how come the helicopter doesn't have a bucket and get water to put the fire out? And we said, well, he's not actually putting the fire out. This helicopter had one of the ping pong ball shooters and was actually starting more fire in this area to get it to burn. A lot of the slash that hadn't burned since 1988, they wanted to get it gone out of there and get that ecology back to what it was supposed to be. And when the wildfires, they got to protect human life and property. At this point, the fire was basically contained in the area, and they were trying to get as much burned out in there as they could before. I got to go to Alaska. This is up in Yukon, and it was interesting flying across the Alaska. The pilot said, everything's not as big as Texas, right? And after flying across that area, I believe it. It was interesting to see, though. Here again, human life and property was what was being protected, and they would let the fires go. If you've seen the TV shows of the people build houses out here and living off the land, they try to protect those as much as possible. Other than that, the fires move on. But and that's part of it. That's part of the landscape. That's part of the ecology. So I'm going to jump back just a little bit to my NRCS job too, which is rangelands management. And what we do at the NRCS is try to make for all the major land resource areas, is develop the ecological site descriptions for these. And if you'll notice here what it looks like, we show here what the different plant communities are, this being the reference or climax state, and then how it moves or transitions from one state to the next, and what caused that transition, and what it takes for restoration to get it back to the more reference state or pre-European settlement to the best we know it. And I asked one of the specialists that has been doing this for most of his career, developing these ecological sites. And I asked him how much the lack of fire or prescribed burning was used in the transition or the restoration. I said 70, 80%. And he astonished me when he said, no, I believe it's at least 90% of the restoration pathways need prescribed burning to get back to this more reference state. So you see a lot of boxes and lines here, and we've got these developed for a large part of the country, but not all of the country yet. It takes time to develop them. So really, if you want to get down to it, it's really all about a box of matches, not a bunch of boxes and lines. The plants, the native plants have adapted. The native animals have adapted to fire as a natural part of the ecological process. So showing here, excuse me, I'm gonna get a drink of tea real quick. This is from Guyette, and it shows the mean fire return intervals across the US. And what Guyette did here was try to take out the human influence on it. But I'll just keep here to Texas. You can see here that the fire return interval for Texas, the biggest part of it was anywhere from 2 to 6 years. Different parts of the country were less, and you can imagine up in Maine and Southern California in these areas, they didn't have as much fire return interval. The California is certainly burning now. We can talk about that later a little bit if you have some questions. But every 2 to 6 years, the area burned across Texas and most of the Great Plains of the US. Another study done by Stanley in 2014, this is the pyrogeography of Texas. He took that of Guyette, what he found, what Frost had found, and land fire, which is taken into consideration. And again, Texas burned for anywhere from 1 to 6 years, the fire return interval. So what happens when you disrupt that return interval? There's a lot of things that happen, and it to the detriment to the ecology and the land itself. So now I'm going to jump into a little bit of why we use fire or prescribe fire. And the friends I have, Pyros R Us, describe it because it's fun. And it is fun. You want to clean out a group of ranchers to go burn. This is a good way to do it. But the folks at Tall Timbers Research Station have really got a good community message out, and they invite people out to watch their prescribed burns. And prescribed fire is a safe way to apply a natural process and ensure ecosystem health and reduce wildfire risk. There's a renewed interest in prescribed burning that has come along. The research on prescribed burning has proven to be very sound and solid. And the other thing is that the cost of managing grazing lands using chemical or mechanical treatments has increased dramatically. And quite frankly, plant communities, many of them, cannot effectively be managed without fire. If it goes too long without fire, you may have to use chemical, mechanical treatments and fire to start trying to restore that and get that ecological process moving again. Fire prevention, as we had talked about, has inadvertently upset the long-established balance, and like I said earlier, to the detriment of the land. Prescribed burning is recognized as technically sound, economically feasible, and an alternative for grazing land managers. The NRCS has a prescribed burn standard that we use to help landowners manage their land, and there is contractual dollars that can go along with that for landowners. But our main purposes are to control undesirable vegetation, prepare sites for planting, reduce wildfire hazards, improve wildlife habitat, forage production and quality, slash and debris removal, seed and seedling production, and the distribution of grazing and browsing animals, and for air quality. Some of the cons on prescribed burning are injure or kill people and animals. Again, there have been very few people that have been killed on prescribed fires. And usually it's not the prescribed fire that did it, nor was a prescribed fire cause an injury. And for the animals, again, the animals are smart. Destroy the property. That doesn't happen in prescribed burning if it's properly planned. Smoke. Yes, that's going to be true. If there's fire, there's going to be smoke. But you can mitigate that with a properly planned, and it's certainly the smoke for a prescribed fire is much less than that wildfire smoke that's going to last for months and really have a detriment on the public health and the air quality in areas. Labor and equipment, yes, it does take labor and equipment, but burn associations that have been popping up across the country are taking care of a lot of that because your neighbors helping neighbors, and they bring the equipment and the manpower to do it. Grazing deferment, yes and no. Sometimes you have to defer your grazing and you lose that grazing for a short time, but the quality of forage that comes back after a burn is much higher than that prior to the burn. But patch burn grazing, there's other ways to burn it to not lose any of that grazing time. Here's some pictures of prescribed fires I wanted to show. I want to notice a lot of it too, that this fire went through, and you would think this is Eastern red cedar, but it didn't burn. We got some of them, but not all of them. It's interesting that they don't always burn. It's a highly volatile fuel, but they don't always burn. But the blackened area is what I want you to pay attention to after the fire has moved through. And the reason I wanted to bring that up was that showing that during the fire, wildfires are a little bit different story in how they ignite and what the weather conditions that are going on during those fires. But for prescribed burning, when the fire moves across, the top 2 inches is cooler than the middle part of the fire, and the top portion of the fire on grasslands is much cooler than the middle part. There's very little change in the soil temperatures, maybe a 10-degree temperature change in the top portion of that, but below 3 inches, there's no temperature change. But that blackened area above the soil, on the soil surface, think about this, when we started burning, we wanted that blackened area burn in March and April and get that soil temperature to start increasing prior to green up. But the soil increased, the temperature down here. We didn't burn anything, we didn't kill anything below the soil, but what happens to the microbes and microorganisms? Do we give them a jump start to start working on those roots of the plants and get those to green up quicker? There's studies going on now about that. I believe it's true, but anyway, why should we use prescribed fire? This is from my good friend, John Weir, who gave me a lot of these slides and some of the talking points. But basically, this is a good diagram with prescribed fire. You're down the creek and you have a paddle, but without prescribed fire, you're going to be up a creek and without the paddle. Another reason to use prescribed fire, bringing the community together, but also a place to take your son when it's not hunting or fishing time. This is my son. He went on his first prescribed burn with me when he was 7 or 8 years old, I think, and he kind of got hooked on it. He's never gotten in trouble for lighting stuff on fire at school, but there he is on the pumper truck. Another good reason for prescribed burning, besides the ecological effects or the photo opportunities that you have, it's good to have a photographer on site when you're doing prescribed fire, and reminiscing with old friends. This is John Weir, Brent Racher, and me. We all three went to tech and got prescribed burning in our blood more or less at the same time, but we're still friends and we still communicate. And when it's possible, go on fires together. The pioneers of prescribed fire, we've got a great opportunity to maintain something they gave us and not put it to a detriment of the land again. We know we can use prescribed fire and do it safely. This is a picture of Henry Wright, who I said earlier was my major professor at Tech, and he certainly was a pioneer in the 80s on prescribed burning. So that is my presentation. Again, photo ops. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you folks this evening. And my wife is a member, I'm a member, and fire is a good thing. Just a little humor at the end. I'll take questions. Bill, Cindy, I'm going to leave this slide up for a little bit if it's okay, but it's something I read in the book, and I thought it was a good ending. And hopefully I didn't go too long.
Wow, Chuck, that was a great presentation. It's really awesome. Let's see if we have any questions in the chat window over here. Well, we do have one here about a landowner. How can a landowner get training on fire?
So there are several ways. Keith Blair does a prescribed fire training for landowners in Texas. He'll have different ones across the state at different times of the year. His company is Red Buffalo LLC. He has a website. I should have put that up. I can get the website, his website to you, but he is the one in Texas that does it. The NRCS does try to host some prescribed burn workshops for landowners. Another good way to do it, North Texas has a burn association. There's quite a few in burn associations across Texas, and get in with one of those to get some experience burning. And if you want to burn your land, you can talk to the NRCS or extension agents. There's a lot of ways. You can call me too, and I can lead you in the right direction. I don't get to burn as much as I used to, but that's kind of what happens when you, with the job and you proverbial ladder of success, if you want to call it that. But I still involved as much as possible.
Would it be okay if people contacted you about questions about burning?
Absolutely. I guess I should have had my email and address or phone number up there, but I certainly, you want me to give that out real quick?
Sure.
So my email is charles.stanley@usda.gov.
Thank you. We have a question here of a Chuck about, I wondered about fire retardant dumped from planes on wildfires. Does that do any good? Looks futile to me. What is it made of, and what does it do environmentally?
So it's not great on the environment, but it is a great fire retardant, and it's called Phos-Chek is what it is. And I'm not 100% real familiar on it, but where they put those drops, when you saw the plane going, they're trying to do it and catch that fire in certain areas. So it's not like the entire area gets covered with that, but enough of the area for the fire to slow it down, and where the hand crews can get in there as well and take care of that, and start getting control of those fires on wildfires. I don't know exactly what the ecological effect is on the grasses or the plants itself. I know it's not good to get it dropped on yourself because it hurts. And I don't know that from experience, but I've had somebody tell me that before. They thought they needed to stand around to see what it was like. But my thinking is, just like with anything, plants are very resilient, and they will come back as quick as they can. If it does have an effect on them, then I don't think the duration would be long enough to make a big difference in the small areas that they're doing. The water is used mostly in a lot of those areas, so I don't know if that helped or not.
In places where they're having these bad fires, like in California and stuff, if they did prescribed burning, would it help them with that problem?
Yes. And I can expound on that. Do you remember the fires in Bastrop a few years ago? It was really bad. So part of that area, they had been doing prescribed burning, and the fire stopped where that prescribed burning was taking place, and the people didn't lose their houses and things like that. But Congress is actually putting forth going to utilize prescribed burning. California CAL FIRE is their big fire agency out there, and they're starting to want to use it more. There are billions and billions of dollars that get spent on wildfire suppression each year now. And what could we do with that kind of money doing prescribed fires? Northern California has got a burn association now, and CAL FIRE itself is on board to start getting more prescribed fires going. And I think it's a matter of the public getting on board and understanding that and seeing what a prescribed fire does, that it's not that devastating thing that everybody sees on TV. And generally prescribed fires are not, they're fun to do, but they don't get that entertaining unless you've got Eastern red cedars or other volatile fuels that go up. There's a lot of planning that goes along with that, but I don't ever want to make it like, don't ever be scared of or don't ever lose the respect for prescribed fire. And in California and other parts where the forests are, that prescribed fire, when they're doing them, those weather parameters are so tied to a good burn that the crowns of the trees won't ever get touched. And the trees themselves, burning around the trunks, they actually need fire. A lot of the pine cones or serotinous, they need fire to open up to drop their seeds. So yeah, prescribed fire is they're starting to understand more and more that it's needed to tackle these massive wildfires, or prevent them, not tackle them.
Well, Chuck, you've talked about how after a fire, good plants come back. I assume that bad plants come back too, right? And why are the plants that come back more palatable to the animals than the plants that were there before?
So yes, you're right. The bad plants can come back too, and they've all been adapted to fire. But after a burn, those plants come back. Let's take a weed, for instance. I don't know which one I want to talk about exactly, but right off the top of my head, but which weed, if you want to call it a weed, it's a forb out of place. The fire goes across there, burns it off, and when it starts coming back, that young succulent growth that's on there hadn't had time to develop its nuances that keep it from being grazed where the animals don't like it. But the protein content in those plants is out the roof. The animals get a lot of good out of it, even the bad plants. So they've started finding that out with this patch burn grazing and letting the animals stay in there. And they'll have different times of year where they burn a small area, don't burn the whole pasture necessarily, but burn parts of it different times. And the animals rotate themselves through it. And when it starts greening up in that black area, the animals tend to go there. And once they get their fill, they'll move back to the older grasses to get the other filler material, if you will.
Well, we got a comment here from Jim Sullivan, who says that the fire retardant that they were talking about is the composition of it is water, clay, and gum for thickener, and ammonia nitrate fertilizer.
Yeah, I don't know. I should know, I guess, but doesn't sound bad to me. Any of it.
That it has the fertilizer in it.
I don't think native plants need fertilizer, but.
Here's another question. Can prescribed burns be done in those steep forest hillsides like we have, like we see in the fires in the west, your photos seem to show fires in flat areas, flat grassy areas, but can they be in steep hillsides too? Prescribed
Absolutely.
burns?
Absolutely. Of course, prescribed burning is much easier on flat land. It's a lot easier to traverse and get equipment around. Also, but it is done and quite often on mountainous terrain. But you got to take into effect the winds that change going up through the canyons and uphill. Fire moves faster uphill, regardless of the wind direction. So you got to take that into account, how you're going to burn it. There's so much that goes into the planning of any prescribed fire that you got to take into account all those aspects, and trust your plan, but also have the contingency plans if you get some spot over. But it is done.
It was an awesome presentation, Chuck.
Well,
Very
thank you. I appreciate having the opportunity.